You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Welcome to Fresh Hell, your favorite international podcast. I'm Johanna from Austria. I'm formerly known as Johanna living in Vienna. Now I'm Johanna living in a teeny tiny Austrian village.
And I'm Annie. I'm still in Massachusetts. I'm in the closet today, though, because there's some tree work happening outside today, so if you hear any strange sounds, wood chipper action, don't worry. Tree work. I'm in the closet.
It's also very possible that you hear Jem and Leela's tiny tippy toes around today, or that my sound is a little bit echoey, like in a marble hallway. That's because I'm still adjusting to the new place, and I have no idea what's the best recording space is going to be yet, until we remodel.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not your grandiose marble hallway. I'm kidding.
Which one of those?
Yeah. Yeah, that's all right. I think all of our listeners know that we record on different continents. We haven't met yet. We're not in the same room. So, yeah. If you're not a new listener, then welcome back. Thanks for joining us today for the second part of the 6 Wives of Henry VIII.
And before we start, we want to thank all of you for your ongoing support and, of course, a special shout out to our newest Patreon members, which are Consuelo Moreno, Diane Kay, Brandy, and Jessica Thomas. We have been severely slacking on Patreon in February, but we haven't forgotten you. We will be recording a new episode after we are done with recording this one. And truth be told, it has been mostly my fault because the last few weeks have been crazy over here with moving and getting the basics set up. So thank you so much for your patience and for your support.
It's not all your fault. I've had like a 3-week migraine. I've been really struggling to get them under control. So definitely not your fault, but it's all right. Everything's going to be fine. We're fine. Everything's fine. So, a couple of content warnings for today, very different from last week. Today, we're going to be discussing sex, sexual health, and just a little bit about grooming and child sex abuse, but really just sort of touching on those subjects in speculation in regards to wife number 5, Catherine Howard. The trend and the norm at that time, it was not unusual for a 40-something to marry a 12-year-old. We'll say it a lot, different times. And, we say that when it's 100 years.
It just gets exponentially worse the further you go back in time, really. And now we are actually creeping out of medieval times and into the Renaissance.
Sorry. We have places here called medieval times. It's like dinner theater, and you go and watch jousting and eat a turkey leg. I think we did it when I was a kid, and it was really fun. But I'm just now imagining people creeping out of medieval times, like on their way to a Ren fair. Sounds fun. I haven't left the house in a year. What's up?
I want a turkey leg now.
I mean, who doesn't want a turkey leg?
So last week we covered the first 3 wives. Please go back and listen to that one if you haven't already. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first wife and queen, with whom he had many children and only a single living daughter, Mary. Henry divorced Catherine in a break from Catholic Church, creating the Church of England, and he did this so he could marry Anne Boleyn, the woman who said no to becoming a mistress. Anne and Henry also had one surviving child, Elizabeth, named after both of their mothers, but when he realized Anne would not in fact be giving him a son and heir, she suddenly found herself arrested for adultery, and she was beheaded on the Green at the Tower of London. Henry wasted no time in marrying his current mistress, Jane Seymour. Jane helped patch up the relationship between Henry and his daughter Mary, and she gave him what he most desired, a son and heir they named Edward. Sadly, as was the case for many women back then, she died of complications of childbirth not long after her baby was born and was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. She was given a royal funeral, first of his queens to have one, and so now we find ourselves at the end of 1537, and Henry is 46 and single for the first time since he was a teenager.
And he used that time alone to just really focus on himself, because he finally learned that unless you're happy with you, you won't be happy with someone else. I'm kidding. It's true, but that's absolutely not what happened. Henry would learn nothing from his first 3 marriages.
He didn't have to. He was the king.
Well, this is it, right? It's different rules when you're the king. At least now he was satisfied to have an heir so that he could prove to everyone that he was capable of having a son, which it's all so strange by today's standards. But he knew from personal experience that, of course, one son wouldn't necessarily do the job. His own older brother Arthur had died as a teenager, making Henry king. So you need those spares as well. At the urging of his advisors, especially Thomas Cromwell, the search began for the next wife, preferably one who would be an ally against both Charles V, who was the nephew of his abandoned first wife Catherine of Aragon, and France, which was full of Catholics who were offended by Henry's break from the church. One of the first people suggested was Christina of Denmark. She was also the Duchess of Milan, another young woman who was a widow at 13. She had actually once been proposed as a match for Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, but the Habsburgs rejected a match to a child born out of wedlock. Her mother was Margaret of Austria, and Charles V was her uncle. I think Charles V is like everybody's uncle or nephew.
Everybody's, yeah.
Yeah. There was so much intermarrying at that time with royalty that I think they were sort of all a little related. So Hans Holbein, the younger, he is Henry's favorite and most trusted painter. He's the one that's done all the Tudor portraits. And he was sent to Brussels, and he arrived in March of 1538, where he would paint Christina, who was still wearing mourning black. Christina was then 16 and was unsurprisingly not very pleased with the idea of this match, apparently having said once, quote, "If I had two heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal," end quote. I mean, that's fair. After a few hit and misses, for a combination of both religious and political reasons, they decided on Anna von Cleves because it was believed that Henry needed a political alliance with her brother, William, Duke of Cleves. He was a leader of the Protestants in Western Germany. Her father had died in the beginning of 1539, and so it would be her brother who would decide on her marriage. Anna was born at Dusseldorf Castle on June 28, 1515. Her father was John III, Duke of Cleves, and her mother was Maria, who was heiress to the Duchies of Jülichburg. All of the places here are a little bit funny because it's a lot of there wasn't really a Western Germany at that time. It's just that's where it would be. There's a lot of that happening. Anna had two sisters and one brother who survived to adulthood. She had not received any sort of formal education but was skilled in needlework and liked playing card games. She could read and write, but only in either German or High Dutch, depending on which source you read. Either way, it was not English or another one of the many languages that Henry could speak or understand. That said, she was known to be gentle, kind, virtuous, and just easygoing, which is why she was thought to be a very suitable match for Henry. Henry had been dealing with an increasingly bad temper as he aged, partly because he had a wound on his leg which would not heal. This then got him into that situation that I think a lot of chronic illness or pain people know so you've got a problem, it means that you physically cannot be as active as you would like to be. So then you start to gain weight, which makes the problem worse because it's more painful to put pressure on it, but now you're just in a vicious cycle, right? I've been there many times. I know I'm not alone. So yeah, this is what was going on with Henry at that time. And Henry was very clear that looks mattered to him in choosing his next bride because he'd really had the rare luxury of choosing not one, but 3 wives for love, right? That never happened. I mean, to get to marry for love once would be amazing, but 3 of his wives, all 3. So it was really important to Henry he find his new wife physically attractive. And so again, he sent Hans Holbein the younger to paint portraits of Anna and her sister Amelia. And he was very explicit that Hans should paint them exactly as they were and not flatter them unnecessarily. I'm not going to make a joke about online dating and realistic photos, but I could. So Holbein paints, and we'll share a photo of this infamous painting. It should be mentioned that the style of dress and head covering is very different from the courts of France and Italy, whose style the English court would have been more used to. I think the painting shows a perfectly lovely, if maybe slightly unremarkable looking young woman, right? I
think she looks fine.
She's pretty.
There's nothing wrong with her at all.
No. She'd probably make a really good spy because she's maybe a little bit like she would blend in anywhere, probably. That's the most unkind thing I can think of to say about her. And Henry saw the painting and he agreed. He thought she looked good, and the marriage would build ties between England and the Lutheran enemies of the king's former nephew-in-law. That's right, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, uncle to everybody.
Like a lot of Europe, Charles also may have believed that Catherine had been poisoned to get rid of her, and there was concern that the Holy Roman Empire and France would join forces and attack England. So she was a diplomatic choice. Her sister Sybil was a renowned beauty, and Thomas Cromwell oversaw all the talks leading to the treaty, which was signed on 4th of October 1539. Henry waived the usual demand for a dowry, and Anna began the long voyage over land and sea. She made a wonderful impression on Henry's men who were part of the entourage escorting her to England. And she spent the time traveling, learning English and some of the card games Henry enjoyed playing. But the one game she did not learn at the much more conservative court she was familiar with were the very complicated rules of courtly love. This would prove to be the beginning of her undoing.
Yeah. Once Anne arrived on land, Henry could not wait to meet his new bride-to-be. So he and some of his men rode out to meet her, and they arrived on New Year's Day, 1540, at Rochester Abbey. That's where she and her group had stopped to rest on her journey from Dover. So Henry really wants love in this arranged marriage. He's a romantic, our Henry. Like, say what you want about Henry, but he is all in.
I mean, he is, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And so he decides to play one of his favorite courtly love games with Anne. So the way it worked was, it's a fucking nightmare. Henry and his men would disguise themselves and then burst in on them to scare and surprise them. Now, the whole point of the game was that true love would let Anne see through the disguise and recognize her husband-to-be. And this was a game that he and Catherine used to play all the time. Anne didn't know this was a thing. So Anne is standing at the window. She's watching animals, we'll say, in the yard, when a bunch of men she does not know burst into her room, and a man twice her age grabs her and tries to give her a kiss. And she's like, what the actual fuck? Who is this impertinent man? How dare you? And so he tries to talk to her a bit, and she's just like, yeah. She thinks he's just some complete stranger trying to take liberties, and she's just looking out the window and ignoring him, and I don't know that there was any coming back from this. So the men then left, and they came back, but this time Henry was wearing his normal, over-the-top royal velvet bejeweled cloak, and the king she now recognizes, but I don't know. I just think the damage was done. I think he still saw himself, which I have the same problem. I think he still saw himself as this young, hot, athletic man of his youth, and Anne not immediately falling in love with him was a blow to the ego that he just couldn't stand.
I agree. And the way he handled it was, again, very immature. But also I want to add, if she would have been head over heels into him, he could have turned it against her as well. He could have said, well, she's not faithful, or she's easy, or you know what I mean?
There was no winning. There was absolutely, there was no way to win.
At all.
No. It's very junior high. I want to say that this is the worst, but who are we kidding? This isn't remotely the worst. So Henry says to his advisors, quote, I like her not. Oh, strong words.
I always love the scene in Tudors.
Yes, yeah. It's like the quotes we know for sure. They show up everywhere. And he's really angry. He feels like Holbein has misled him. And fortunately, Hans had painted a beautiful miniature portrait of the king's son and heir, Edward. And so after he was upset about, this painting, he gave him this miniature he'd made him as a New Year's gift, which he loved. So I think he might have saved his own life with that little miniature portrait. But Henry was adamant that he was deceived, that Anne was ugly. He wanted Cromwell to get him out of the marriage contract. But it was pointed out to him that this would be the opposite of chivalry. If he refused her, it was unlikely she would find another match. Moreover, she had done nothing wrong, and if Henry refused her, it was not outside the realm of possibility that her brother would start a war with England, which just nobody needed that. So let's talk about the wedding. And I'm quoting Alison Weir here because her book is actually the one I have closest at hand. We do like the ones by Fraser and Starkey as well. As usual, check our sources. But this is to quote Alison Weir. So, the wedding day, Tuesday, the 6th of January, 1540, was the feast of the Epiphany and the last day of the Yuletide celebrations at court. The king was up early and dressed in his wedding clothes, a gown of cloth of gold embroidered with great flowers of silver and banded with black fur, a coat of crimson satin slashed and embroidered and fastened with huge diamonds, and a rich collar of gold about his neck. At 8 o'clock, accompanied by his nobles, he paused in the galley leading to the chapel where the marriage ceremony would take place, and declared, "My lords, if it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do what I must do this day for any earthly thing." And he looked pointedly at Cromwell. However, there was no time for further recriminations, as the bride was coming, escorted by the lords sent to fetch her. Anne was wearing a gown of cloth of gold embroidered with large flowers of great orient pearls. Again, it was cut in the Dutch fashion, having a round skirt without a train. Her long fair hair was hanging loose in token of her virginity, and she wore a coronet of gold set with precious stones, with trefoils resembling bunches of rosemary. About her neck was a costly necklace, with a matching belt around her slim waist. Walking between the Count of Oberstein and the Grand Master of Cleves, with her face composed and her expression at once demure and serious, she followed the lords into the king's chamber, out the other end, and into the gallery where Henry awaited her, and together they proceeded to the chapel royal where Cranmer would marry them. Anne was given away by the Count of Overstein. On her finger the king placed a ring engraved with the motto, quote, "God send me well to keep." When the ceremony was over, the king and queen went hand in hand into Henry's closet to hear mass and offer their tapers, Anne obediently following the rituals of the established faith to please her new husband. After mass, the bridal party was served spiced wine. The king then went to his privy chamber to change into a gown of tissue lined with embroidered crimson velvet, while Anne went with her ladies to her own chamber, escorted by the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk. A little after 9, the king and queen met in Anne's room, where a procession formed, Anne's sergeant-at-arms and all her other officers going before her, and thus in stately fashion the bridal pair passed through the palace to their wedding banquet. End quote. So, I just like the description of clothes, to be honest. That's why I shared that. So next, of course, is the wedding night. You know how it goes, the formal bedding, all that jazz. Well, the king did confide to Cromwell the next day that he was unable to consummate their marriage because he found her to be so revolting. He said she had a bit of a tummy, and her large breasts made him pretty sure that she was no maid. She must have had children before. Now, I can almost hear the collective eye roll of our listeners with that one. But wait, it gets worse. He said he couldn't bear to have sex with her, and then he made sure his physician, Dr. Butts, great name. I'm pretty sure Dr. Butts was the same second best doctor that he'd sent to take care of Anne Boleyn when she had the sweating sickness. Mm-hmm. Dr. Butts is still around, and he made sure that Dr. Butts let everybody know the problem with non-consummation of the marriage was Anne's revolting body and also her very terrible smell. It definitely had nothing to do with his age or poor health, as was evidenced by the fact that the king still had, quote, duas pollutiones nocturnus insomno, or 2 nocturnal pollutions, or today, what we would call wet dreams. So the doctor's like, listen, everyone, it's not the king's fault. She is heinous, and she smells bad, and he still has wet dreams all the time. So it's a really weird brag, is it not?
I get it though. He was proud that he could still get it up twice in one night uncontrollably. And as you said before, he still wanted to be the young hot man he once was. And he definitely had a problem with aging and with all the things that came with it.
Ugh, same. But he didn't have the option to just buy a supercar and have a modern midlife crisis, right? I mean, it just wasn't an option yet. So in the meantime, it seems that Anne, who was very much liked for her kindness, generosity, and easygoing manner, she doesn't really have any idea that anything is wrong. And this bit confuses me a little bit. I don't know if Anne wasn't taught the birds and bees, but there's a story that's related often, and it goes that in February of 1540, so about a month after they were married, Anne is speaking to the Countess of Rutland, and Anne talks about Henry, and she's praising him, and she says, quote, when he comes to bed, he kisseth me, and he taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart, and in the morning kisseth me, and biddeth farewell, darling. The implication here being is that she was saying that she hoped she'd soon be pregnant. And Lady Rutland responded, apparently, quote, Madam, there must be more than this, or it will be long ere we have a Duke of York, which is all this realm most desireth. End quote. First of all, ouch. She needed a friend, right? but it seems to sort of imply maybe that Anne did not know how children were conceived and thought that a kiss in the same bed might do it, and no matter what my mother may have told you, it does not. I'm not sure what happened there, but Henry wants out of the marriage, and Anne notices that one of her ladies-in-waiting has caught his eye, but it's a teenager and she's not concerned. But when the Catholic alliance between France and Charles V, which Henry feared would come to pass, never happened, there was even less of a reason to keep his marriage to Anne. On the 24th of June, Anne was asked to relocate to a different estate. I think initially they said, "Oh, we want you to go to this other castle because the weather's a bit nicer," and so she went. And this seems to be something he did with a lot of his wives. Like, just go here, the weather's nicer in this other place.
Just move them out of sight.
Yep, but on the 6th of July, she was informed that the king had decided to reevaluate their marriage. It wasn't long before she was asked if she would agree to annulling the marriage, and that if she would agree to it, she would be given the title of the king's sister, and she would only be below himself, his heirs, and any future queens. In addition, she would be given estates, including Hever Castle, which was Anne Boleyn's family home, and a generous sum that would be paid annually for her expenses, as well as an entourage of servants. So, Anne may not have been sophisticated in the ways of courtly love, or particularly well educated, but she was no fool, and she said yes. The one condition I think must have been difficult is that the letter that she sent to her brother explaining the end of her marriage and her new position as the king's sister, as well as all mail sent to her family, would be seen by the king first, and she had to agree not to leave England. So she was alienated from her family, but she kept her head and her heart, and she was still alive, which was more than we can say about his first 3 wives. The marriage was annulled on the 9th of July, 1540, by Henry himself because he was now the head of his own church, thank you very much. Cromwell, who had been the driving force behind the marriage, was arrested for treason. He was condemned to death without trial, lost his titles and property, and was publicly beheaded on Tower Hill on the 28th of July, 1540. Henry would later come to regret Cromwell's death, but not the end of his marriage, because he was ready for the next wife. And he had his eyes set on 15-year-old lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Katherine Howard.
And he really wasn't wasting any time this time. The king's marriage to Katherine Howard took place on the same day as Cromwell's death, and just a few weeks after his annulment to Anne was final. Henry was absolutely besotted with his new wife, whom he called his rose without a thorn. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated, because for a long time Catherine was known as the, flighty wife who liked pretty dresses and had a bit of a sordid past in a time when the age of sexual consent was, brace yourself, 12 years old. Most of the biographies you'll read portray Catherine as a sexually promiscuous little vixen who wrapped a 50-year-old king around her pretty little 16-year-old finger, but who also had a lover on the side.
Yeah, it's really tough, and I think the attitude might be starting to change a little bit on that front. There are 2 books, one by Connor Byrne and another by Gareth Russell, that are both on Catherine, and I think they explore this topic. I have not had a chance to read either of them yet, but they're on my lists. Have you by any chance read either of them?
No, I haven't.
No. I think the point we want to make about Katherine Howard is to just maybe keep an open mind. It was a very different time, so we can't hold girls who were 13 or 14 to today's standards, right? It's almost like you're walking a strange line between standing up for a girl who was young and was maybe sexually abused because of her age, but at the same time, you don't want to treat a woman who was at that time considered old enough to marry, have children, run a household, would often speak multiple languages, like a child. Even though by today's standards, she is absolutely a child. It's a tough one. And so we're going to lay out the basic facts for you, and there'll probably be a big discussion about this one in the Facebook group. I'm looking forward to it.
So we'll begin with her birth, but there's a problem. We don't know exactly when that was. This is part of the issue with the king's youngest queen. We aren't absolutely sure when she was born. Her father and Anne Boleyn's mother were siblings, making them first cousins. She was the second to last of 11 children born to her mother, who died when she was around 5. And her father then sent her to live with her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who had a couple of large households with many girls belonging to members of her extended family living in genteel poverty. And it wasn't at all unusual for the noble families of Europe to send their children to be educated and trained in other households, but the Duchess spent most of her time at court, and the supervision there was not what one would imagine for a young ward. Now, it depends on who you read, but one of two things was happening at Chatsworth House. Either the young ladies who lived in the girls' dormitory were unlocking doors and allowing boys and men in at night who would give them gifts and who knows what else, or the key to this sleeping space was easy for men to get a hold of if they wanted to and the door rarely locked, and the girls were left vulnerable to predatory men. She was not a scholar, unlike the previous queens who had many talents, but at that time it was enough that she could read and write. She was graceful and she enjoyed dancing. She wasn't particularly religious, although coming from a more Catholic background, and the more conservative factions at court would later see this as a benefit.
Yeah, Anne of Cleves was also very malleable as far as religion was concerned. She was sort of happy to go with whatever the ruling faction at the time wanted her to be, which at that time was a trait that could just, keep your head on your shoulders.
This was also very, very common in that part of Europe that nowadays is Germany, that the people living there had to change religion more or less often, always depending on who the ruling, how do you call it, baron there was, or the count.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah.
Now we know of two relationships that Catherine had when she was a ward of her step-grandmother. The first was her music teacher Henry Manox. And again, depending on which source you read, Manox was either in his early 20s or mid to late 30s when he began the relationship with the then 13-year-old Catherine. And you're probably cringing at that, but remember, one of the women Henry was considering as wife 5 had been a 13-year-old widow. We know they were intimate but never had intercourse. What we don't know is if it was at all consensual at the time. This relationship ended, and it wasn't long before Catherine was wooed by Secretary of the Dowager Duchess, Frances Dereham. This relationship does seem to be consensual and public, at least among the other maids of honor at the Duchess household. They were allegedly lovers and called each other husband and wife. Now, if that was true, then if they said vows and had sex, they would be married in the eyes of the church.
And can I just say that in a country where divorce was pretty much impossible, the church made it really easy to get married, didn't they? It's like, I love you, I consider you my husband, let's have sex, done.
Yeah, it's very problematic.
Yeah.
So then step-grandmother finds out there's been sex under her roof and she puts an end to it immediately, and she sends Frances off to Ireland, and Catherine leaves to join the court as lady-in-waiting to the king's then fiancée, Anne of Cleves. And it's now 1539 and Catherine is 15, maybe 16, and being young and beautiful and enjoying dancing, she was probably having the time of her life. And she, of course, catches the king's eye and soon becomes his mistress. He's generous with her, giving her jewels and expensive gifts. He wasn't so prone to giving his other mistresses or wives, and there's no doubt that factions within her family was encouraging this relationship. Henry and Catherine were married on 28th of July 1540 at Oatlands in Surrey, and Catherine was somewhere between the age of 16 and 19 when she married the king, who was 49 at the time.
They had so much in common, though. They both loved how she looked in new gowns and jewels. They both liked soup. They could talk or not talk for hours.
She was also said to be a good and loving wife to Henry, which at that time may not have been the easiest thing to be.
No.
Now, we know a lot of places mention Henry's 52-inch waist, but there are other things. More problematic would likely be the terrible mood swings and increasingly bad temper, and he also had that very smelly festering sore on his leg that wouldn't heal. But she had a lovely demeanor and was happy and cheerful and loved to dance. Their first New Year's together, he showered her with jewels including, quote, 2 pendant laces with 26 fair table diamonds and 158 fair pearls, a rope of 200 large pearls, a square pendant with 27 diamonds and 26 clusters of pearls, and a muffler of black velvet trimmed in sable fur, hand-sewn of course, with 38 rubies and 572 pearls. End quote. At least some of these had belonged to King's former wives because his coffers were pretty bare, and there was also no lavish coronation planned because, most likely, he couldn't afford it. And that New Year, Mary came to court to visit, and she was unsurprisingly very underwhelmed by her father's newest wife, who was younger than her by somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 9 years, and may have ironically been named after her mother, the first ex-Mrs. Tudor.
Yeah, luckily Anne, who had only just recently been cast aside due to her hideous visage, also came to court as the king's sister. Sorry. I feel for Anne. And she was friends with both Mary and Catherine, and so she was able to soothe some ruffled feathers there. She may have been wearing one of the new gowns she purchased in a variety of bright colors and luxurious materials, which was one of the first things that she did with her freedom and wealth post-annulment. And it's kind of funny because they always mention how, like, as soon as a woman gets any kind of financial freedom at all, the first thing she does is buy herself a bunch of new dresses.
Yeah.
What else are you going to do? Like, really? At that time.
Go to the hairdresser.
Right.
Take a vacation.
Yeah. You weren't flying to the Bahamas. No one was going to Disney World. You bought a nicer outfit than the one you had before. Anyway, her interest in the latest fashions was shared with Catherine, and it's said that one night, Catherine and Anne danced the night away when the king's leg was acting up. Just one big, happy family, which I'm sincerely glad for on Anne's behalf.
I think Anne was just really glad she dodged a bullet there.
Oh, God, yeah.
Or a sword. Yeah.
Big time.
And Catherine as queen was popular, so she made some pardons happen which had been approved of by the court. She made appointments, old friends would write and ask for a place at court, and she was always happy to oblige, which in hindsight was maybe not the best move. Something to be said for letting the past be the past. And meanwhile, Archbishop Cranmer, who had helped Henry get the annulment from Catherine of Aragon, he was in favor of the reforms, and when he heard rumors of Catherine's youthful indiscretions, he was more than happy to do his duty and pass these rumors on to the king. Catherine and the Howard family were Catholic, though Catherine doesn't seem to have cared either way. But getting rid of Catherine would again better suit Cranmer. The rumors had been shared with Cranmer by a man whose sister had lived in the same dormitory with Catherine during her days as a ward of her step-grandmother. And when Henry learned of these rumors, he did not explode with rage, as many who knew him then might have suspected. He simply didn't believe these rumors. He thought they were just mean comments by people who had been jealous. But he did ask Cranmer to look into the matter, just to be on the safe side. Both Catherine's music teacher and Frances Dereham were interrogated. And Frances was easy to find. During the Northern Progress made about a year after they were married, when the Queen arrived at Pontefract Castle, she was soon greeted by him and asked her for a job at court, which she granted him.
So I'm never sure with Catherine how much of her is like innocent, naive victim and how much of her was normal, healthy teenage girl with raging hormones but very poor impulse control, or, as they would have said at the time, an unclean, promiscuous whore who knew the rules and broke them. I don't know. She's the real mystery for me, I think. Because Starkey says in his series on the wives that Manox confessed that he was passionately in love with Catherine, but that she was a noble lady and him a servant, and so she only let him grope her a bit. But that Dereham was socially equal. He was like wealthy merchant, and she was sort of poor nobility, so they sort of evened each other out a little bit. And he confessed that Catherine and he had sex and planned to marry.
And again, like Henry liked to do, Catherine didn't know about the investigations at all, so she was shocked when on 5th of November she was dancing with her ladies, and then the king's men burst in and they're saying, you know what, there's no more time for dancing, and she was then confined to her quarters. The next morning Catherine tried to reach Henry, feeling certain if she could just see him she could explain and he would forgive her, but the king's men stopped her. And she was dragged back to her chambers, screaming and crying, and she would never see Henry again.
Yeah, she's said to haunt the gallery at Hampton Court where this happened, that they see this young woman screaming and running down the gallery. But that's a different episode if you are interested, listeners. Maybe the afterlives of the six wives one of these days. We'll see.
So Catherine was questioned by Cranmer, finally writing this confession, which was likely heavily influenced by Cranmer. And there's also another long, rambling letter that sounds way more like it might be from Catherine. We'll post a link, but here's the official confession. Annie, would you mind reading it?
Yeah, no, of course. I'm not going to do an English accent. You're welcome. All right, so this is excerpts from the third and final confession letter from Catherine Howard. We're not going to read the entire thing because it's an older form of English. Anyway, you'll find the whole thing posted with our sources. So, the confession goes, in part, quote, I, your grace's most sorrowful subject and most vile wretch in the world, not worthy to make any recommendation unto your excellent majesty, do only make my most humble submission and confession of my faults. And then she goes on to say how she is undeserving to be his wife or even his subject, and she says how terribly, terribly sorry she is, and she says, My sorrow I can by no writing express, nevertheless I trust your most benign nature will have some respect unto my youth, my ignorance, my frailness, my humble confession of my faults, and plain declaration of the same, referring me wholly unto your grace's pity and mercy. First, at the flattering and fair persuasions of Manox, being but a young girl, I suffered him a sundry times to handle and touch the secret parts of my body, which neither became me with honesty to permit, nor him to require. Also, Francis Derham, by many persuasions, procured me to his vicious purpose, and obtained first to lie upon my bed with his doublet and hose, and after within the bed, and finally he lay with me naked, and used me in such sort as a man doth his wife, many and sundry times, and our company ended almost a year before the King's Majesty was married to my Lady Anne of Cleves, and continued not past 1/4 of a year, or a little above. Now the whole truth being declared unto your Majesty, I most humbly beseech you to consider the subtle persuasions of young men and the ignorance and frailness of young women. I was so desirous to be taken unto your Grace's favour, and so blinded with the desire of worldly glory, that I could not, nor had grace to consider how great a fault it was to conceal my former faults from your Majesty, considering that I intended ever during my life to be faithful and true unto your Majesty ever after. Nevertheless, the sorrow of mine offences was ever before mine eyes, considering the infinite goodness of your Majesty toward me, from time to time ever increasing and not diminishing. Now I refer the judgment of my offences with my life and death wholly unto your most benign and merciful grace, to be considered by no justice of your Majesty's laws, but only by your infinite goodness, pity, compassion, and mercy, without which I acknowledge myself worthy of the most extreme punishment." End quote.
Catherine's confession was premarital sex, which would embarrass Henry, but it wasn't a crime. And it wasn't even a grounds for divorce. But while the Queen was being questioned, Cranmer was still on the hunt for any more information on her, and eventually came up with the name Thomas Culpepper. He was one of the young handsome men who reminded Henry of himself in his youth. He served the king, dressed him, slept at the foot of his bed in case the king needed anything, and he and Catherine were rumored to be courting before she caught the king's eye, and lovers after she became queen. And question was Lady Rochford, one of the queen's ladies in waiting. She was the widow of George Boleyn, who had been executed as part of the downfall of his sister Queen Anne, and she had helped Culpepper and Catherine to meet in secret, and testified she felt the two had definitely had intercourse while on northern progress at Pontefract Castle, making the Queen guilty of criminal intercourse.
See, Pontefract isn't just known for its delicious licorice candy, but also criminal intercourse.
Criminal intercourse was, of course, a capital offense, and when Culpepper was searched, they found a love letter from the Queen, who would pay for breaking the king's heart and making him look a fool. On 14th of November, Catherine was taken from Hampton Court to Sion House, one of the many convents Henry dissolved, and Catherine thought this meant she wasn't going to be sent to the Tower. Of course, she was wrong. But first, Henry would take his rage out on Derham and Culpepper, two men the king believed had carnal knowledge of his wife. They were executed on 10th of December 1541. Culpepper got the axe, but Derham, he was hanged, drawn, quartered, and there are conflicting reports about exactly what that meant, but it was probably that he was hanged almost to the point of death, then cut down, and while still alive he was castrated, and then disemboweled, beheaded, and chopped into 4 pieces.
I mean, that'll do it.
I think that's enough, yeah.
He's not a vampire. It'll... Just saying.
The head then would be placed on a spike, and Catherine likely would have seen it when she was moved to the Tower.
Yeah. And there was more than one Thomas Culpepper alive at this time. One of them was a rapist and murderer. And so some historians wonder if naive Catherine had been taken advantage of again. But I think the majority of historians don't think Henry would have allowed somebody with that sort of background as one of his closest courtiers, even if he had received a pardon, just because of the whole law and order deal of his reign.
On 11th of February 1542, Parliament passed a law declaring it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king.
Oh, motherfuckers. Like, you can't make it a law after the fact. Come on. They did.
Catherine was charged with leading an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous, and vicious life like a common harlot with diverse persons. Of course, this is a quote and not my saying.
Yeah.
And the next night, Catherine would be in the Tower where she asked for a block so she could practice putting her head in it. She was beheaded in a private execution as her cousin Anne had been on the Tower Green, not Tower Hill. She's also buried in the small chapel St. Peter ad Vincula, where her cousin Anne rests.
Yeah, one interesting note, and I'm not 100% sure this is true, but apparently Mary didn't really care when Catherine died, which that's no surprise, right? She was younger than Mary, and Mary was unimpressed by that. But Elizabeth had apparently adored her stepmother, and when she heard the details of her stepmother's death, the 9-year-old future queen vowed then and there that she would never get married. So, I don't know whether that's really the reason she never did, but anyway.
I mean, her father definitely wasn't the best role model for relationships.
No, not at all. And they all had issues, I think, with relation. You think your parents messed you up, Jesus. Yeah, not you, but you know what I mean. Okay, this brings us to the 6th and final wife, Katherine Parr. She had grown up in a well-to-do family. Her father died when she was young, and she was close to her mother. She spoke English, French, Latin, and Italian, and would learn Spanish when she was queen. She wasn't much of a fan of embroidery or any of the usual feminine pursuits, but she did love learning. She was first married to a man around her age when she was about 17. He died young, and they had no children. Her second husband was also arranged. He was twice her age, and she also had no children with him. She had been widowed twice, but was still young and pretty, smart and charming, very much in love with the late Queen Jane Seymour's brother, Thomas. Henry was about 52, and maybe he was still hoping for a spare for Edward, a younger son, but he was getting old for that time especially, and his health was increasingly poor. Catherine was 30, and not only was she a warm and comforting presence, but she was very intelligent, and she sought out information on topics that interested her. She was also very religious. When they were married, it was a very small ceremony, only about 20 people. The king, at that point, often had trouble walking without help, and they were married in July of 1543 at Hampton Court, and both of the king's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were there. She tried to have a loving relationship and to have them both spend more time with their father. Catherine was also the first Queen of England to also be crowned Queen of Ireland following Henry's adoption of the title King of Ireland. Henry really depended on her, and during his last military campaign, he actually trusted her to rule in his stead, which was a privilege he previously had only granted his first wife. The big problem with Catherine was her religion. She was an evangelical, and she wanted the Bible accessible to as many people as possible. Henry was not happy to see the Word of God used by the common people. I think it's accepted now that really Henry, deep down, is a Catholic still. He just felt like he was the highest authority to God, not the Pope. And having been raised Catholic in a very Catholic family, I have to say I was actually really shocked the first time I went to Mass in England. It's virtually identical, Church of England and Catholicism. Now, we're going to get a lot of letters, but this is what I've observed. They believe transubstantiation is symbolic and not literal. Priests can marry and women can be vicars, and that's pretty much it. You can get divorced, obviously. I'm sure this is an oversimplification. I just remembered thinking at the time, like, wow, a lot of people were burned alive for what today seem like very minor changes to, But of course, they weren't minor back then. And Catherine's strong views on the subject, they weren't cute like when Anne Boleyn had suggested them. Catherine was also a lot more extreme and bold. She even published a book of Latin religious text that she translated into English, and the 12-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who at that time was fluent in 5 languages, made her father, the king, a book that she had translated by hand as a New Year's gift. Catherine was very proud. Henry was not amused. So there was a faction of conservatives, religious conservatives, who were trying to work against her, but she made peace with the king and she managed to avoid being arrested as a heretic. Kind of a last minute, kind of saved herself. And they burned heretics back in those days. Henry died on 28th of January, 1547, and he was interred with Jane Seymour. That was the queen who had given him an heir. After the king's death, Catherine was allowed to keep the queen's jewels and dresses. The jewels in particular would cause quite I'm going to call it a kerfuffle. It's like when there's a kerfuffle and everything gets real fucked up. But that is a story for another time. About 6 months after Henry's death, Katherine married her fourth and final husband, Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, who she had been in love with when she married Henry, which is bittersweet because he wasn't really that great of a guy, and he had actually kind of made moves on Princess Elizabeth before settling for the king's widow. But as far as she was concerned, she was blissfully in love and happy, and at 36, all of her wishes came true because she got pregnant, and she had a daughter on August 30th, 1548, and named her Mary, after the stepdaughter who hated her the most. Yeah, and all was well for 6 days until September 5th, which is when she died of complications in childbirth. Hers was the first Protestant funeral to be held in English in Great Britain. She is buried at Sudeley Castle, which is beautiful, and I have been there, and that's where I actually took the photo I posted last week of lace that Anne Boleyn had made. They have like a nice museum part. I've got photographs of her tomb and the grounds. It's beautiful. Her body actually had some weirdness happen to it over the centuries, but yeah, I think I'm going to save that for the Afterlives of the Wives episode if you guys want that follow-up on sort of their ghosts and other weird, macabre, post-mortem facts on the queens.
I definitely want that episode.
I think that'd be fun, right? Because there's a lot there. The last of the wives to die was Anne of Cleves, who died on the 16th of July, 1557, 8 weeks before her 42nd birthday. She's believed to have died of cancer. With women back then, well, for the most part, it was childbirth, then cancer, seems to be, She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August, and she is the last of Henry's wives to die. She outlived Henry's last wife, Katherine Parr, by 9 years. She wasn't the longest lived, though. Catherine of Aragon lived to be 50 when she died, also of cancer. So, yeah, that is the end. So, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. There you go. 6 wives of Henry VIII. Oh, so yeah, this was an interesting one because Anne Boleyn was the wife I knew most about and who I sort of thought was the most interesting. But now I'm a lot more curious about what the deal was with Catherine Howard and what the true situation was there. Yeah.
I never really liked her a lot, but actually I think I should reconsider my prejudgmental thoughts.
That's how I feel. Yeah, that's also how I feel. But I feel like a lot of what we've read about her has been, she was just this flighty, sex-crazed.
Foolish.
Yeah, foolish, empty-headed. All she wanted were pretty jewels, and she was just stupid. And I don't know that that's true. I don't know that we'll ever know. I mean, at this point, we're just reading people's interpretations of the texts that remain from the day. But it's something to think about, and maybe just think about, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Something good.
What's your something good?
Opus got a cookie. Opus got a cookie. Opus got a cookie. He's terrible at it. I usually throw cookies at him, like for practice, and they just bounce off his face, and he looks like startled, and then he looks really hurt, and he gives me this look like, why'd you throw a cookie at my face, Mom? And I feel guilty. And then yesterday, his sister Daisy, her mom had posted all these pictures of her catching cookies at daycare. And so when Paul came home, he tried slow pitching a cookie to Opus, and he caught 2 in a row. So that's pretty
awesome.
That's exciting. Last night, I had a mammogram while I had a migraine, so that was painful.
Are we still talking about something good?
Yeah, that was good. The good part was I got really, really high. It's obviously the only way I could do it. So Paul drove me in because I had a full-blown migraine, aura, flashing lights, the whole deal, super queasy, vertigo. I'm stumbling in there. I sit down. She explains what we're doing. And I say, okay, so I'm just taking everything off from the waist up, right? And she says, yep. And so I sit down and start taking off my shoes. And then I told her, I was like, I'm sorry. I'm very, very high on account of this migraine. I'm fine. I'm just not quite with it. You don't need to take your shoes off for a mammogram, everyone. Leave your shoes on. Don't take them off in the hospital. Hospital floors are gross. So yeah, that was my something good. That's really all I've got this week. Opus got a cookie. How about you? You actually have good stuff.
My something good? Well, we live in this teeny tiny village now where 200 other people live, and now obviously we're talk of I can't even say talk of the town.
Your talk of the village.
But everybody just, whenever they see us in the street, they stop and they talk to us and they give us bottles of wine and they're all super friendly.
That's really nice.
I hope it stays that way, but they're really nice. And I wake up with, roosters and the peacocks.
Screaming peacocks.
It's so quiet here.
That's nice.
I can't wait for you to come and visit.
I can't wait.
It's going to be a lot of work and yeah. It's going to be fun, though.
It's going to be beautiful. I can't wait. I can't wait to see what you do with the house. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, please, please go check out our sources for this episode. There are so many books and articles and podcasts and YouTube links and just all kinds of stuff that will help you find out more information if you so desire.
Also, please, 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 if you have 5 seconds, and if you're listening to us on iTunes or Apple Podcast, please go and leave us a rating and or review.
You can go to freshhellpodcast.com. That's where you'll find all our links. So if you want to get in touch with us, if you want merchandise, if you want to join our Patreon, you can find us there.
Please tell all your pets we said hi. Hug them, cuddle them, be kind to them. We miss them. We love them.
We miss you and love you too. And we'll see you next week. So if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.